Now for a quick disclaimer. Nothing you see or hear on the flight deck is investment advice. Nothing said today is intended as investment advice. Those participating in today's discussion may have bought, held, and/or sold the stocks discussed today prior to today's discussion and/or may do so afterwards. Remember, you are responsible for your own investment decisions, and if in doubt, you should seek advice from an independent financial advisor. Stocks can be high risk, and you may lose the entire amount you have invested. Please now sit back and enjoy the flight.
Hello. Oh, we've got a sound effect. I like that. And welcome back to the flight deck. We're going to have an update call today with Robito, with Sporazene, and with Alaskageophiz. Welcome, everybody.
Evening, all. And we're here in Alaska. Welcome.
And we're live. It's been some time, right?
I was having a look, actually. The last Pantheon-related flight deck we recorded, I think was with Max and Eric, and it was February 2026, of course. It was pre-AGM, so pre the change in the management team. Seems like a long time ago. It is a long time ago.
Gosh, it is, isn't it? I guess the pause, the hiatus at Christmas on the Dubby flow testing was a critical thing in terms of finances and being prudent with the cash. And then we had that fundraise that we will not mention today, or maybe we will mention today at, was it 7p? And
I was going to say, which one you're referring to, Flight? There's been a few
well,
recently. Only one at 7p, though.
Only one at 7p. And hey, look at the price now. It's ripping. Oh, gosh. So I guess this is an update. We're going to just talk through. I mean, there's not a lot to talk through, frankly, is there? I mean, we need to talk about the management changes, obviously. I think there's lots of frustration after the Dubby flow test was paused. There was huge expectation on that. We were going for what we thought was the best reservoir, the SMD, and the idea was to put a show me well straight down the middle of that. Do you want to just give us a quick overview of what they were going for in Dubby, and then we'll lead into the pause and then subsequent management changes?
Sure. Again, the Dubby well was the shelf margin delta, the SMD, or the top set, however you want to talk about it. It's the better quality reservoir near the top of the middle Schrader Bluff. And what they did was drilled a pilot hole. They actually found more shelf margin delta B interval than they expected, close to 600 and some feet, when they were expecting more around 500 foot, which is even thicker than most other areas in the Apun prospect area. They then did the pilot hole. They then picked the landing location to drill a horizontal well approximately a mile long going in the southwest direction. And they did 25 plug-and-perf fracture stimulations. Again, what they do is they go to the toe of the well, the far end of the well, and they fracture stimulate that. They put a plug in. They do the next job. They do it all the way back to the heel of the well, which is basically the closest to the drill site. And then they have to wait some time, get the equipment pulled in there for testing units. And so they move the frac crew off. They bring in the testing unit. And that took several weeks, I think, before they were actually doing that. And that whole time, the fracture fluid, which is about 200,000 barrels of mainly fresh water with a few additives, that's sitting in the reservoir under pressure. Some of it's perhaps bleeding off into the reservoir, but most of it's in the fracture stimulated areas, the fractures themselves. They brought it on, and again, they have roughly about 10 days. They know they're going to kind of clean it up, and they go to these frac tanks, which takes produced water and any sand that may be coming out at that time. But they're learning from LK2, the frac stimulation flow back there was be careful how you bring on the chokes and don't flow it too hard, otherwise sand could come back. So they took their time, they carefully managed the chokes, and they didn't see a lot of sand. So they're bringing the well back on, they're flowing it. They're getting, 3,000 or so barrels per day, and that's something you can probably put up on some visuals as we're talking. And then gradually the pressure starts to decline a little bit, and you start to bring on a little bit of gas from the formation. You're hoping to bring on more oil, and then all of a sudden it's going down a little bit lower than they want for the flow rate, so they bring on some nitrogen to help lift the well. they get the rates back up. So the total liquids coming out are higher, probably in the 2,000 to 3,000 range for a while. But again, the oil they expected, in my opinion, earlier than they saw it. And by the time they shut in the test, they'd only got about 100 barrels of total oil, which is not great. But they showed during one of the webinars, I believe, where they had a similar well, one of the Alkaid wells, where it took about half the fracture fluid to come back before they saw the significant increase in oil production. So they feel like they were right about at that level where it would have come back, but they were spending an awful lot of money, about $150,000 per day in the winter, $50,000-ish for nitrogen lift, $50,000 for the well test equipment, and maybe $50,000 for some of the trucking and some of the other stuff associated with the test. So they had a couple strong winter blows, snow coming in, high winds and stuff, and it's a long way to haul that disposal water, and I'll get to that in a minute. But they basically said, look, we're going to put the company at risk if we have an issue here. So let's shut it in. We're going to do a pressure buildup test, which is really a pressure gauge near the bottom of the tubing. And they shut it in. Then that's going to show the pressure buildup since you took some fluids out. Basically, the fluids that flow back in to replace those fluids from the deeper part of the reservoir. Tells you how good the permeability is. If there's skin damage near the wellbore, if there's faults or other things that might be impeding some of the flowback or maybe even enhancing the flowback. So at some point, they're going to pull those gauges or the gauge or the memory from the gauge and basically tell us a little bit about the reservoir and how good or bad it is. And at that point, hopefully they can go back to their actual flow test, which then brings up the Megrez well. We just got some new information a couple weeks ago where they want to do a aquifer exemption and a Class 2 disposal application with Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to turn that well that they drilled as a slant well to get to their target for Megrez, turn that into a disposal well. So instead of taking, for example, W fluids 20 plus miles up to Prudhoe or even further to dispose of water, they can now go 2 miles and put it in the Megrez well, which was not doing anything at this point, and inject it there, save a bunch of money, hopefully. And they can probably put in 5,000 if they change the tubing out to 3.5-inch tubing. They could go up to about 8,000 barrels per day of injection. So that's a pretty significant amount of fluids they could dispose of quickly. The other thing is that they may go back to W and basically change out the tubing there and put it maybe an ESP or some other type of artificial lift to basically pull that well a little harder and get the oil flowing a little bit more promptly. So that's kind of where we're at.
I guess, look, the obvious question on all of this stuff is why is the company not really releasing any further information on all of the topics that you've talked about, right? So all we've really had from the company is they did a presentation to the legislature in May, and they talked about a plan for restarting Dubby. They all talked about something else. We'll come back to the Alkaid one shortly, but they talked about a plan for the restart of Dubby. And we previously, when we talked to Eric in February, he wasn't sure how long they would keep the pressure gauges down there for. I think it was the longer the better. But I've got to tell you, I think they've completely sidelined Dubby. I really do. I don't think there's going to be anything that comes out of the farm out relative to Dubby. I think the Alkaid field, from my point of view, unless the company tells us differently, which they're not doing, I think the Alkaid field is on the back burner for the foreseeable future.
I can see how that comes out with the lack of communication. Again, I really wish they'd share some more of the data and core and the geologic side of things. And for example, Megrez, have they given up on those shallow Saginavertok and Prince Creek formation zones since they're turning it into basically a disposal well? Or is that just a good use of money right now to help with the W testing? Again, I don't know the seismic reprocessing. Again, another kind of thing that we know is going on that they want for the farm-in deal, farm-out deal. But we've heard very little about that, and we don't know when it's going to be done and if they'll release an RNS or some messaging to show, how good the data got cleaned up by doing the reprocessing. And again, I'm a geophysicist, so I know what they can do if they put their head down and get after it.
Yeah, I mean, you are a geophysicist, and I'm going to put on the hat of asking the dumb questions in the room, which, as you guys know, isn't that difficult for me to do. So just going back to when we were at the W well, we were expecting oil to cut through, and we were getting excited. It was reaching that 50% flow back of the frac fluids, and we knew from the previous well in this reservoir that it cut around 55%, and so it was so frustrating, wasn't it? It must have been a coin toss on whether they took the risk and flowed through, or just to see whether oil had cut. Here's a question. So to my mind, even if Sporazene's thesis is correct and W is not going to feature because they've pivoted to Kodiak, isn't it still a quick win to get the data back from the pressure buildup?
Yeah, in fact, if I was doing it, again, the way I understand this particular pressure gauge works is it's almost like a Bluetooth thing, and they'd send a sensor down through the tubing. It would then download data, and then you'd pull the wire line or whatever, lower that down, and you could then look at the data and analyze it. So you'd almost want to do that sooner than later, just make sure the gauge is actually doing something, as long as it doesn't change the pressure response of the well by going up and down with slick line or wire line. So you could even perhaps do that a couple times during a longer test, just to make sure, again, you're getting recording, because they aren't getting that data sent to the surface as far as I know. The second thing on there is they put in all this fluid, and the longer you let it soak, the more chance it has something to do with, maybe wettability changes in the reservoir. So they did take a full core in the pilot hole for Dubby. We haven't heard anything about that. They have some zones deeper, some of the slope fans. They found some pay in there according to the log and the cuttings analysis and the VAS volatile analysis system. So, there's a lot of potential here, but that well just sitting here waiting for good weather to go off and test it. In Alaska, this is as good a weather as you're ever going to get in the summer. So, why aren't we doing that now? I don't know, other than, again, Michael Spencer said our plan A, and we're going to be military about it, is to get after this farm-in deal and get the right people that can not only help fund the western northwest Kodiak appraisal or well, but perhaps they can do some other things. They have the technical expertise to fill in gaps that Pantheon doesn't have. And Pantheon's a very small group. They claim in one of the webinars they have like 14 people around the world, supporting all this stuff. And that's really not much when you start looking at, you're trying to develop a field, you're trying to do planning for wells, you're trying to just honor your commitments to the state, for various things. They've also brought in a driller, Vance Hazard, who worked at Santos, which is the Pekka field that's being developed right now. Actually, the first oil was just about maybe weeks or months ago going down the pipeline, perhaps. So it's a good person. They're drilling horizontal wells. They're fracture stimulating. He's a good man to help with some of the Pantheon planning.
So we've got the W pause. Then we had a fundraise. Then as a result, shareholders were upset with the pause, upset with the fundraise, and we had management change. So let's look at that. We had a change of chairman, David Hobbs outgoing, and Michael Spencer took over position of chairman.
We also have two new board members, Marty Rutherford, who basically came from working with the state of Alaska as like deputy commissioner and acting commissioner at Department of Resources. And then David Wilkins, who is a vice president at Hill Corp. David's actually bought some stock since he's joined the board. And of course, you probably remember Michael Spencer also put in a fair amount of money into stock recently too, which at least for a while helped get the stock price back up a bit.
Yeah, we're always happy with that.
Right. And Flight, look, I think the previous strategy, which was to focus on Ahpun, Alkaid zone of interest, and get those two parts of the portfolio into production as quickly as possible because they're close to the pipeline, close to the haul road. We could drill them from pads basically adjacent to the Dalton Highway. I mean, we spent probably the best part of 200 million executing that strategy. Okay. And from my point of view, that failed. There's absolutely no question in my mind that we got to the end of the Dubby well, and at best the outcome was inconclusive. I would say, look, sitting here right now, the outcome for me is very conclusive. They have said very little about that well in the last 5 months. I take the point that Michael Spencer said the focus was going to be on Kodiak and getting a farm out done, which I'm definitely supportive of given how weak the balance sheet is. But at the end of the day, looking back at the previous board, the direction and strategy that they set, and I think that was in part with Jay Cheatham as CEO. Obviously, it was Jay's decision and Jay's board to drill the Alkaid well, and David continued with a focus on the parts of the portfolio that were close to the highway. So from my point of view, it was the right thing to do to change out the board. The previous board, as I said before, I don't think had defined the right strategy, or they'd certainly made some assumptions around the productivity of the reservoirs, which clearly didn't materialize.
So I'm a bit less harsh, I guess, on the previous strategy. I'm still in the inconclusive, because I get the point of the SMD flowed at Alkaid-2 and showed oil, then why is it not done the same at Dubby? And which one then is the correct representation of the reservoir? Because it has flowed oil before, and obviously gave them confidence to go after that. I do think that any strategy for a small appraisal company that's trying to avoid dilution is completely dependent on having successful appraisal. And unfortunately, that's not what we've had. So, but I guess that's kind of what I think I signed up for, that sometimes the reservoir just won't deliver, and therefore you'll get failure. I don't necessarily think it was the wrong strategy in hindsight, if we have indeed got failure. I do sometimes question why we went to Magrez, but then Magrez was very, very, very close to being like a Hail Mary play, which, we still probably found, and we're pretty good at finding oil, to be fair, another 1 billion barrels of oil. And then I think I've spoken about with this with GeoPhys before, that at the point at which it failed, they just seemed to be extremely unlucky. I think we've spoken before, maybe Kodiak is probably the only oil wet reservoir that has been found on the North Slope before Magrez, and we found another 6 or 7. So we went from finding the first one, based on the feedback for GeoPhys, to finding another 6 or 7. So whilst I can question that, I've got to admit the people that made the decision to go for Magrez again just got particularly unlucky, and almost at the very, very last hurdle fell flat on the face. And I'm afraid that can sometimes happen, I guess, in oil exploration. So please step in, Gio, if I'm misquoting you or misrepresenting you.
No, you're fine. Again, I've not given up on either of the 2 wells myself, and again, I don't think they do a Class 2 disposal well at Magrez necessarily if they'd given up on Dubby, because I guess they call it Theta West 2 or Polaris, I guess, is the new name for the possible appraisal well. That's still 20-ish miles from the Dalton Highway. I don't know if they'll go that direction for an ice road to drill it, if they drill it, or if they come out of either Kodiak or Southwest Prudhoe, which might be a shorter distance to a main road. So again, I don't know that you would do Dubby and spend time and effort on that if you didn't have some plan to use it. It could also be beyond Dubby. It could be the first step towards Ahpun development, whether that's at Alkaid or at Dubby.
And they should have got the cores back by now. So I would have thought, and I'm not a market expert, that if anything in that core data suggested that it wasn't as before, they would be duty bound to report that. If it was deviating from what we'd seen elsewhere. So that implies to me that the oil saturations in Dubby are akin to what they thought they were going to see. Yes, it's not flowed that oil yet, and there could be a number of different mechanisms for that, but we should have heard if there was something pointing to something different we expected.
And I think the plan all along, too, was to use the Dubby well as the demonstration, or the show me well, so that they had the gas to supply the AK LNG, Alaska LNG project. And again, between the project being a little slower at AK LNG with the state senators kind of messing things up there, it's the timing for us. It would have been nice to have the gas to demonstrate it right today, but it's we're a little behind on that. And of course, the LNG project's going a little slower than they probably hope.
And I think on the strategy that, going for Dubby compared to going for Kodiak, if we went for Kodiak alone, we probably would have got another 1 well in it, and we might have found more oil. We'd have to squeeze in a well test, and what's a relatively short winter season on on a location that's further afield. Would the market have rewarded us if that came in? Because we've already found 1.2 billion barrels of oil at Kodiak, and we're at 7p. If it turned to 2 billion, maybe you would have still got the questions. Oh, but is it? We've only seen a short-term test or whatever it may be. So I have very little faith in the market assigning sensible market price to the stock. And therefore, could we have built on Kodiak a partially successful or successful test at Kodiak? I'm not too sure. So for me, it did make sense to try and get something that can bring in near-term cash or revenue in the form of, I guess, the gas deal, which would have been to fund the rest. So I'm a bit more forgiving than you, Sporazene.
Well, I think we've sort of, we've had a shot, right? We've had Megrez, we've had, Alkaid 2, although Alkaid 2 probably was, more successful than the market gave us credit for. But ultimately, that field it, on a standalone basis is really marginal, right? I'm not sure people would necessarily. We certainly wouldn't develop that on a standalone basis. So we needed Harpoon to produce a lot alongside it. But I think the conclusion, certainly that I've come to so far, is that we've not been able to deliver commercial flows out there. So at the end of the day, if somebody is in the data room right now and sees it differently and wants to put some money into finishing off the Dubby testing program, and they've seen the pressure gauges and they like what they see a lower cost route, maybe pumps versus nitrogen lift and so on, then great. But I'm not sure. I don't see the company coming out to investors like you and me asking for money to go and finish off the Dubby testing program. So that's my conclusion. Why I think it's gonna, unless somebody that's in the data room decides that they want to put money into it, I think it will probably stay in the back burner.
There was a thing from Zeus today on Flight's investment server, Pantheon, about the. I think they were valuing it at 42p in the risk version, and then 370 in the unrisked version. It's probably as good as the paper printed on, but it's.
I think a big percentage of the valuation came from the Harpoon field, and quite honestly, I just don't see that. I don't see why you would continue to hold a big percentage of the company valuation on a part of the portfolio that's not been proven to be successful, and I don't see a plan from the company to restart that. As I said before, somebody could well be in the data room and be quite interested in participating in the Harpoon field, but I see a lot more potential in Kodiak, of course, and we'll see what materializes from the farm out process. It's running up against the time window. I think from memory, the last well that we drilled that required an ice road was Talitha, and we had the permit application in with the state on the 1st of October for that one. So, that's sort of 8 weeks from now, pretty much. So we're in the window.
The strategic pivot to Kodiak, it's seen as like it's now explicitly the cornerstone asset, and always was. And Max's comment, I did have a chat with him in the summer, really was that you always drill your best rocks, and to him that the basin floor fan in Kodiak is the company's flagship reservoir. So that asset's 1.2 billion barrels 2C liquids, 5.4 TCF of gas. They're huge numbers. And the comment Max made to me when we spoke was that any industry in the data room looking at the data will just see what he saw when he came in to look at Pantheon's assets. And he said they won't form a different conclusion. So whilst in this vacuum, it seems, of information, it's super frustrating. His message to me on that call was, we have the professionals at the helm, let the professionals get on with it. It was both the most reassuring comment I heard and the most frustrating, and at the table, my critical brain wanted to jump in with 10 questions on why you're not demonstrating professionality, because it feels like a a blackout of information and a blackout on the ops front. What's going on? And yet I held my tongue and I tried to remain humble simply because he is an industry professional and I'm simply a retail shareholder with a little bit of knowledge, a fraction of what Alaskageophiz has in terms of geology. But I think it's time, isn't it? It's time that we heard. It's time that we heard where this new management are heading. I know everything seems to be leveraged around the farm out, but there are shareholders out there, and I'll speak from now, who are worried that a farm out won't be concluded, or there may not even be. It may not be concluded with a cash element where G&A is even covered.
The terms, right, is, how much of the asset are you going to give away? Yeah. And I would say there seems to be a general consensus that the seismic reprocessing, which appears to be a dependency for some parties, has been left quite late to get the seismic reprocessing completed, and it doesn't leave a particularly large window for data room participants to analyze. Whether that's true or not, I really don't know. Maybe.
Do we know if that's back? Have they got the seismic in hand?
Well, we haven't been told, right? We haven't been told. I think there's some kind of let's say there's some social facts out there that it was back in the second half of July. But if you kind of follow the train of thought that the window for potential farminees to analyze that seismic data is relatively small, therefore it may not necessarily be a major that farms into the assets at this point, then I think you're looking at maybe a smaller or a mid-sized player farming into the assets. So the question is, how much are we going to give away? Are we looking to give away this time around? Are we looking for a kind of portfolio deal, or is this just a single well deal with a contingency for follow-up wells if we're successful? So I think it's definitely the terms that investors are interested in. Of course, getting a deal done in the first place, right? I think that there's a general consensus among investors on the server that we can't wait another 12 months to drill this well. It has to be done this winter. So given that we've got a perceived small window to get the seismic data reprocessed and analyzed by participants in the data room, then there appears to be some risk around actually getting a deal done in the terms of that particular deal. So I'm not surprised, Flight, to hear the feedback that you've had from some investors around concerns on what we're going to get.
Gio, could you maybe talk about what the reprocessing does? And, I guess you can do a farm out at any stage, with or without the reprocessing, but the reprocessing will certainly add to that information. How big an impact do you think that reprocessing will have? Obviously, it could improve or decrease valuations, but, do you see it being absolutely pivotal to a farm out deal?
Well, let me step first to the geology. When Pipeline State penetrated the basin floor fan, and then Talitha, and then Theta West, they're all areas where the sediments are coming across an older shelf edge, and you had a sea level drop, so it was cutting into the shelf edge of the pre-existing one. So you have a very focused energy source for the best rock close to what they call proximal location, which is next to the shelf edge. It's going to be in a channelized, confined transport mechanism, and as it goes down dip, it spreads out, and the sands get more frequent but thinner, which is what we saw at the wells we had previously penetrated. And again, we know they flowed oil, both Theta West and Talitha, and from Pipeline State. But as you get up towards the new location, you're going to go to better porosity, permeability, because it's shallower, less depth of maximum burial. But your focus is now going to be a little more tight, where you want to drill the best rock in the channel and understand how big these channels are. Now, that's where the seismic's going to come in and help you. So the cleaning up the seismic is usually several different things. One is getting rid of all the noise. There's noise during acquisition. There's noise if you didn't pick things very correctly or filter out the things that you wanted to filter out. So they'll go back and reestablish good field data to bring in. They'll then stack it with the right velocities, which is again another trick to improve your data. And they'll remove things like multiples. We have lots of coals in these areas at the shallow level, and coals can bounce energy back and forth, creating what we call multiples. They can remove some of those. And the other thing is that we know from isotropic and anisotropic velocities that if you were to try to flatten the data, which again, I'd like to draw a picture, but you get the data from the seismic and you stack it and flatten it. And then the flattened stuff is taken back to what they call a common midpoint gather. But as the velocities from like the north are slightly different than velocities of the east, that single line of peaks that you're trying to flatten on has a little bit of a wobble. And so the north might be a little faster, it wobbles down. The area east is a little slower, it wobbles up. And that whole thing is stacking stuff that doesn't want to stack in a nice straight peak or trough. That creates a bit of lower frequency kind of noise in there. So again, they have ways to get that more improved. Then the last step is migration. They usually do that post-stack after they've stacked the data. They migrate it, which is to move things around into the proper position. They could also create depth migration, which is a little more expensive and time-consuming. But that's typically when you have a lot of really steep dipping events, which we don't really have in this area. So I think they're going to clean it up. I've looked at some 2D data that was shot across this potential updip area, and it's not exactly real clean data up there. So I don't know if that was a question of their processing wasn't very good or just that general area is not the best to improve. But the other thing happened, I think, was when Farallon and the state stopped paying the state tax credits for seismic. That was in 2016 when they're doing the original processing. The team probably assigned to do that, plus the processing company that knew they probably weren't going to get paid, perhaps. They may not have hit that as hard as they could have compared to some of the earlier 2015, 2014 seismic surveys. So, there's a bit of, was the seismic originally ever processed as good as it could have been? And my guess is it probably wasn't. So there is some improvement, I think, just by spending time and effort on it. Then the question is, that area going to be good enough where you can actually see data better than you could have in other areas? Like when I worked out in National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, the data out there was fantastic. You didn't have to do a lot of stuff to make it look like all the cliniforms and the shelf edges just popped out. But this area has always been a little more challenging than areas I've worked elsewhere in the North Slope.
Given the windows closing on getting a transaction across the line with a farming partner and the seismics, let's say it's in hand now, how quickly would they be able to turn that around?
Really quick. First started doing 3D seismic. We'd interpret line by line, pick faults line by line. And now you can just seed a couple points on like a peak, tell the computer to go off and interpret all the similar peaks that are tied to that peak. And you can do that in an hour, 2 hours.
All right. So that's not significant.
Yeah. Now to do the AVO, amplitude versus offset, and some other high tech things like spectral decomp, that'll take a little longer, but it's not like months.
Yeah. Okay. What Max? So I pushed Max in the summer on the winter drill and asked him directly. I said, Max, are we getting a winter drill? And his answer was yes, we're drilling. So obviously he couldn't elaborate on how they get that drill done and who funds that, but he pointed again to the data room being busy and multiple parties, and that was stressed.
And I guess they could be working collaboratively with some people in the data room. You know what I mean? I don't think they necessarily see it as like, we're not telling you anything until we get everything. They could be working collaboratively through this, and they could even be getting advice at times from or maybe we should do this and maybe we should do that, depending on where they are in the discussion point. So
yeah, and the geophysicist that they hired for Pantheon used to work at Repsol, I believe, and then before that he worked at Rock Solid Images, which is a company that I worked with doing the original Alcade AVO work. So these people probably have a bit of background that's going to help them speed through some of this stuff.
I'm really surprised actually that they haven't used the market more to create a little bit of competitive tension in the process. Whether we like it or not, our share price is always going to be a factor in the negotiations. We obviously don't want our company valuation to have any sort of direct correlation to the asset valuation right now. Let's hope that they're able to make that differentiation. But obviously we are languishing at a 12p per share valuation, whilst that has increased, as you quite rightly pointed out earlier, Flight, from the 7p placing that was done back in February. It's still at multi-year lows. So it's in the company's interests, firstly, to keep the market updated, And I think secondly, to get the share price up for many different reasons. And I think I'm not the only investor that is very, very surprised about the lack of information that's been shared by the company. I think the one thing that we did have to go on, which was the presentation that was done by Eric and Pat Galvin to the legislature back in May, was relatively light on detail. But again, there were some things in there that I thought could have been explained to Pantheon investors either before or afterward, such as the Alkaid recompletion. I think that's the first time we've heard about the Alkaid 1 or 2 well being dusted off for recompletion. And I think there were some comments made by Eric in that presentation about potentially being in production within the next 18 months. Yeah. So
I've got a new gimmick here on the platform. Hold on, let me just pull it up. Where is it? There it is. Okay. So we heard that from Eric. 18 months. So let's just...
we did. Drum roll.
That was seamless. Absolutely seamless.
Did someone say oil production? Hold on.
But look, Flight, on a serious note here, I think we're all battle scarred. I mean, I'd love to be here, talking with you guys about halcyon days as a Pantheon investor. But I would say, unless you've been extremely lucky and been trading the ups and downs of Pantheon, if you're listening to this as a Pantheon investor, you're going to be losing a lot of money, and probably quite a lot of money. I would say Pantheon, in my portfolio, far and away is the biggest loser in financial terms. So I'm pretty skeptical about the whole situation, as I'm sure many other people are. And for the company to be saying nothing about anything, quite honestly, of any great detail, I'd love to be sat here in 8 weeks' time and to be reading about a brilliant farm out with some tremendous terms. But I'm obviously pretty skeptical, and I'll be honest with you, I think the company's lost its way a little bit in terms of how they're engaged in the market.
But look at the French have made Sporazene,
Priceless,
shouldn't always be valued in money terms, It's been a tough time, and I must admit the amount of times I've thought, this is it. We've done it. We've cracked. Megrez was certainly one of them. Some of the early kind of days of Alkaid, and even after the recompletion, you're like, oh, we seem to have always kind of snatched the defeat for the jaws of victory. So
I was only thinking about that exact phrase the other day, Roberto. I mean, that frames it absolutely perfectly.
Yeah. One point I was going to make earlier was just about, I've not heard anyone yet come in and completely poo-poo the assets that associate with any credibility, to be honest. There's been a number of bear articles, and, a lot of it used to focus on it's just too tight. And that's quite frankly, not true. There's industry modelling that understands what certain porosity and permeability does, and that doesn't point to it not being productive. Problems we're having are elsewhere, but too tight certainly isn't one of them. So, and we've had various oil people that have come in. David Hobbs, who invested, now. Is it David Wilkins is the one of the new appointments as well, and he's invested, and that echoes what Max was saying. It's like they'll see what we see. So I know it's very negative times at the moment and frustrating times, but to me the assets is still there and has got every chance of being commercial, and we can get. I think the strategy now, it probably was time to look at multiple shots on goal, as Max would say, and we did have multiple shots on goal with Megrez and Dubai, but when the way they were going, we had to get more multiple shots on goal, basically. So I think it was a fair, frustrating but fair time to pivot to make sure that we get something, and of course that's back to the point about the farm out terms. That's only going to be a success if we get a farm out that has it's a multi-well farm out, basically with more shots on goal.
My sense is we're not gonna get that this time around, though, right, Roberto? And maybe they decide to try and give away a small percentage for a single well, knowing that they might get better terms later on down the line with a second farm out. I mean, that could potentially be an option for them.
And is that just because of the valuation? that you think will only
Could
get
be the
one?
valuation, and it could be that, the point that we were making before about the seismic being available. The perception is it's a relatively tight window, and it may mean that certain parties, certain of the bigger players, might not be prepared to move quicker. I think Max has used phrases like game ready partners before, so I would say the implication there is maybe it's not a Repsol or an Exxon or one of the majors, but a mid-range player.
I don't necessarily think we want a major, to be honest. I think we need someone that's probably got a bit more flexibility and maneuverability than one of the big majors. I wouldn't necessarily put Repsol and Exxon in the same phrase there. I could see it someone kind of mid-tier rather than one of the super majors, certainly. So I don't give any credence to this judging it on the farming partners will look at the share price and yes, and they'll see how much we need money, but I don't think they'll take the share price as a realistic valuation of the asset. They'll know what it's worth because they're oil men. Pantheon guys will know what it's worth because they're oil men. Pointing to a random bunch of strangers over there that value differently from the oil men doesn't seem to be a credible strategy, to be honest. So.
Yeah, to the point of oil men. I mean, it's worth just commenting on David Wilkins, who's joined the board. He's former Hillcorp Alaska SVP. Joined as a new non-exec director and brings Alaska-specific operational credibility. Alaskageophiz, most of the people on the slope. Have you come across David Wilkins?
Not directly. I left in 2014 from BP, so they didn't really step into the role at Prudhoe and they really turned around Hillcorp. So wrote an article, I think, somewhere on your server about them turning that around. But I think the thing that really kind of strikes me is the reason where we're at is we don't have a way to sell the oil close to us. If you're going to go through Prudhoe or Milne Point or, ConocoPhillips or Hillcorp, so you basically going to get taken to the cleaners with facility sharing fees and your transportation cost to get whatever you're trying to get to their location. So to me, the idea we're going to get some type of funding through either the AKLNG or through partnering with a service company or something else was to get that $20 or so million to get the hot tap. And I don't see that moving forward in the near term unless it's really behind the scenes. But again, that's going to take a fair amount of money to kind of do that, plus the ability to take NGLs from basically flaring them to using them as a valuable commodity to put into taps. So I wouldn't give up on the Appoon area. Again, it's the closest to the roads and the eventual transportation of oil. When you start going over to the northwest up in Kodiak, you've got the period of appraisal, you've got the period of building facilities, and potentially you've got some big facilities to handle that much oil. So my idea was stick my toe in the ocean, but not jump in full blast yet. But that's just me.
The strategy is to shift to Kodiak, and Max and Eric see the other fields as satellite fields, as they call it. We have to look forward, right? So if let's just say they get the well away and they're drilling in the sweet spot, then they're likely to hit another 1,000-foot oil column. Would you say
less than that? Probably
less than that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, this stuff is going to be more buoyancy driven. It's going to have potentially water beneath some of the oil filled sands as opposed to basically in the basin floor fan we've already talked about. It's kind of quasi-continuous or light tight oil, where pretty much everything is charged in there to some degree. But as you get into porosity above 12% or so, you now have buoyancy wanting to take the oil up into a more formalized trap. That trap is what really the seismic's going to be out there trying to identify, and then reduce the risk by identifying things like flat spots or AVO or fluid indicators. But once they get that, they're going to then have to drill it, and they'll have enough porosity permeability where they can flow it probably even unstimulated if it's as good as they think. And you won't need to bring in frac crews. You won't necessarily have to have a long test to get, your fracture fluid recovery, the flaring issue, how long is the state going to let you do the flaring, all those things that take up time in the winter.
It's an appraisal well of an already discovered huge reservoir of 1.2 billion barrels, and it could add another billion barrels.
Yeah, the upside, if you look at the the high side that I think they did in the independent assessment stuff. There's a big high side there, which is, again, higher recovery factors instead of, 8% recovery factor like the deeper parts. You could be up in the 25 to 40% recovery factors. But you'd be putting in injector wells and producer wells and trying enhanced oil recovery, things like that. So it's got the big upside. You just want to find the right rock that can then be depleted with the right mechanisms.
Yeah. And they think they've got that. I mean, even the CFO, Teresa, put out a comment on LinkedIn, and I think she used 3 billion barrels.
Well, it's 2.8 marketable liquids on the 3C flight. Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is huge stuff. I invested on a broad brush thesis that if they can get the Permian flowing, then they should be able to get these reservoirs flowing. But again, we're moving into conventional stuff here with this new well. So,
which goes back to Megrez. Class 2 disposal well, if you start looking at the logs, which we've never had access to before, up in the shallow stuff, it looks like there's a bunch of pay up there. And these are getting better quality sands for the most part. The question is there something else that can make them not flow like, perhaps we're seeing a W or Megrez? So there's a lot of different things that I don't have access to help pin down the right answer yet.
Yeah. So can I just give a shout out to you, Alaskageophiz? On the server, you're in the middle of doing a 1 of 4 post on those well logs at Megrez. There's some stuff to look forward to there.
Part 2, I actually showed, I went through almost all the oil type logs for the various fields and pools, and I posted a number of those to show you that once you get above 7 or 8 ohm meters, and I even picked 10, you basically have generally oil and it flows oil. So when I'm looking at these shallow sands from 3 wells on the exhibit in that Class 2 document, I can see what looks exactly like stuff that flows all around the North Slope. Well, there's always hope. If I can turn Sporazene's frown into a smile, I feel like I've done my good work for the day.
There we go.
And that's one of the frustrations. We've always found more oil than we expected. Have we got it to flow in commercial volumes? No, and I believe that's quite important. But
I will give you preview number 4 too. Part 4 is when you have an oil column that potentially was in the 1,000-foot range, like at Megrez, and it's a buoyancy-driven trap with individual sands all connected to each other somehow. You first of all have to have a trap that's going to accommodate that size, 1,000 foot of column. But the second thing you'll see is hydrostatic gradient, which is water. You can plot that at pressure depth plot. And then when you start plotting up the hydrocarbon zones, if they plot along a hydrocarbon pressure gradient, which is less dense than oil, you should see that as something you can measure. But to me, Hecka, they have a great plot that shows how this should work. And, if we can see that in some of the other wells out here where pressure does changes, get higher in the hydrocarbon column, that would be a really positive thing to see.
Mm.
I'm sure I didn't explain that very well at all. But
I'll review. Okay, should we go to final comments, guys? Or do you just want to talk about the World Cup, Robito?
it started well. And it kind of ended well for me. But I got to see
when the
live.
English got knocked out.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't mean that. I meant that I was wanting Spain to win, but no.
That's how I took it.
I got to see us beat Haiti. That and I remember before I said if we only get one result, let it be the one that we're going out for, and it turned out we only did. And you guys had a good run. Well done.
We did.
We'll pass that on to just unbelievable Jeff.
Final comments.
It's been a long winter. Like no doubt about it. And in fact, I think we're kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel here. Probably 6 or 8 weeks, perhaps, before we get news of a farm out, and then it's kind of downhill into the Kodiak drill. So it's been a tough time as a Pantheon shareholder, no doubt about it. As I said before, probably the worst performing stock in my portfolio and losing the most amount of money right now. But I think we're all looking forward to the Kodiak drill. We're looking forward to the quality of the farm out that Max and the team are able to secure, and we'll see what the well drills.
to Revito?
Yeah, I think I think there is still hope. We've still got a lot of oil there. I remember someone commenting on Discord, as you know, of that. I think it was something like we've lost our USP if the gas line isn't there. And I'm like, the USP to me has always been we've got billions of barrels of oil onshore US. You know what I mean? Now, I don't think it would take a lot to turn the tide in terms of if Kodiak comes in and people start believing it, and then they start thinking you've got the money for a poon, and then before you know it, people start thinking about McGrath again. So we do have billions of barrels in our, and industry professionals seem to think it should be commercial. That's not to say it will be, but everyone that seems to have reviewed it so far, and certainly some of them have followed it with some of their money, have think it should be commercial. So proving that to the market is a different thing, but hopefully we'll get there.
Okay. And Alaskageophiz?
I'm still holding out lots of hope. And again, I think if I'd been working this, I'd do more on the communication side, which I don't understand why they're not. But the second thing is you're sitting above world-class source rocks. You've got unitized acreage, so no one's going to take it away from you unless you don't comply with whatever the requirements are for the unit. So it's not like someone's going to just swoop this out without you getting the agreements you want. You may still not be happy, but you're going to have some negotiating position that other companies that would just love to have this acreage. Lots of oil, as Roberto said, it's come up. It's gone into the tighter rock first. It's light oil, 35 to 40 API oil, which is great. And then as it gets up in the shallow stuff, it gets more buoyancy driven. It's more classical traps with higher recovery factors and shallower drilling. So all good.
Yeah. My final comment would be, I guess we had the key operational event in W1 appraisal and the pause, hence moving on to Kodiak. So we wish Max and the team well in those negotiations. We hope that they're coming along. We get to hear about them soon. So thanks for joining, everybody. Until next time, cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Thank you from all the crew here at the Flight Deck, and hope to see you soon over at Flight's investment server, sharing industry insights for the good of all.